I've spent a fair amount of time researching the connection between firms' corporate performance and levels and changes in stock prices over time. And that work developed into the CFROI life cycle valuation model that today is widely used by money management firms. I've also spent a lot of time in researching and applying systems thinking. And Mark showed you that book, Free to Choose Medicine. That's a proposal, it's my #1 interest right now. It's a proposal to radically restructure the FDA to allow patients advised by their doctors to make informed decisions about the use of not yet FDA-approved drugs. And the Free to Choose Medicine Act of 2012 should be introduced sometime in the next 4 to 5 months in Congress. Now, today's presentation will cover some of the material in that wealth creation book, but most of today's talk will focus on this recent paper of mine, Management's Worldview, 4 critical points about reality, language, and knowledge building to improve firm performance. And there's a free download. It's an SSRN paper. So let's get started. Let me define for a moment what I mean by a worldview. A part of and result of one's process for building knowledge, the ideas and beliefs through which we interpret and interact with the world. And if you're into systems thinking, it's called a mental model. Now, we can get a handle on a worldview by starting with the brain itself. This is a quote from Chris Firth, who's really a top neuroscientist. And I like this quote a lot. By hiding from us all the unconscious inferences it makes, our brain creates the illusion that we have direct contact with objects in the physical world. What I perceive are not the crude and ambiguous cues that impinge from the outside world onto my eyes and ears and my fingers. I perceive something much richer, a picture that combines all these crude signals with a wealth of past experience. My perception is a prediction of what ought to be out there in the world, and this prediction is constantly tested by action. In a nutshell, we see what our brains tell us to see. Now, there was a fascinating scientific article a while back called What the Frog's Eye Tells the Frog's Brain. Has anyone come across that paper? It's a wonderful piece of work. I'll give you just one punchline from this. What a frog does, it's got this tongue, it sticks out when flies go by. The fly sticks on the tongue, and that's how the frog eats a lot of its food. Well, if a fly, it stops right in front of a frog and doesn't move, the fly does not exist. The frog does not perceive a fly. Now, this gets back into how our brains work and the role of assumptions. So I'm going to talk about visual perception, and in a sense, we can see how us human beings are somewhat like a frog. Now, let me go back a little bit. This goes back about 30 years. I've always been interested in the deeper issues on research methodology. How do we know what we think we know? I spent a lot of time on that. And one of my early papers, I really dug into the literature and philosophy, and I found that to be an incredibly low return investment of my time. And then I shifted over into visual perception because I like concrete stuff. And let me give you an idea of what I'm talking about. During the 1940s and 1950s, a genius, Albert Ames Jr., did work on visual perception. And even today in psychology textbooks, you'll see the Ames distorted room. And back in the 1940s and 50s, the idea of perception is an object out there in the real world, and their light rays hit your retina, and then your brain decodes the real world. Well, what we're suggesting here is that our deeply held assumptions are at work in creating perceptions of the world out there. So what Albert Ames did, he had a whole series of demonstrations. This is his most famous, and it's called the Ames Distorted Room. I flew to San Francisco to experience this, because you really need to experience this stuff. There's a museum called the Exploratorium in San Francisco. It's all about neat scientific stuff. Okay, I knew everything about the room before I looked in the room. And here's what the deal is. You look into this room, and you can have two people walk in the room. One person goes in one corner, one person in the other corner. Now, your brain has to make a choice. All of your assumptions built up in walking on level floors, rectangular windows, rectangular buildings, talk about a strongly held assumption. Now, either you discard that and see people of the same height, or you make the people shrink. And that's what happens. On one corner of the room, you see a midget. On the other corner of the room, you see a giant. And this is really, really, to me, important stuff, because this is what's going on all the time when we're researching questions. Now, here's an interesting question. How does your perception change when you're looking into the Ames distorted room? Now, it changes by concrete feedback. In other words, if you throw a ball in the room and start touching the room with a stick, you get different experiences that your brain says, I need to discard that assumption that for this room, all the things about level floors and rectangular windows holes, and then you perceive, the world differently. Now, there are 4 points in this paper. Here's the first point. Our perceptions are rooted in assumptions based on what has proven accurate in the past. Now, I'll give you an example. If you're driving going into an intersection, you're going to turn left, and there's a car, you don't turn left because the car is too close. Now, throughout this presentation, I'm going to be talking about language and drilling down into the assumptions that are hidden behind the language, and this has enormous implications for creating wealth. Now, in the example of the car, what's the hidden assumption when we say the car is close? The hidden assumption is that bigger is closer. Now, most of the time, in all of our experiences, that's a very good assumption to make, especially driving a car. But it's not always true. And in the Ames demonstration, that's one of the things that he manipulates to show the unrecognized role of assumptions in creating what we perceive to be an objective, independent world out there. Now, the second point, we improve our worldviews by embracing the diverse opinions of others as part of organizing feedback that can identify the outright obsolescence of one or more of our key assumptions and promising new ideas which may be inconsistent with our existing worldviews. Okay, think of an organization that does really, really leading-edge creative work. Now, I think design firms would qualify for that. So if you look at what design firms do, typically they focus on not having a bunch of smart people sit at a table and just come up with ideas. Rather, what they do is they do prototyping. That someone has an idea and that they very quickly make a prototype. It doesn't have to be very fancy. Then you try it out. And then you find out that you uncover certain assumptions. And so it's that cycling through, building up a knowledge base by getting the concrete feedback. Now, in business, I've really been impressed by Eli Goldratt. Many of you have probably read his book and the novel, The Goal. Goldratt developed the theory of constraints, TOC. And sadly, Goldratt died last year. But in any event, Goldratt was an absolute master and this is not reflected in the novels that he publishes. When you really get into Goldratt's work, by creating logical maps, drilling down, and uncovering hidden assumptions, which is the root to creating enormously wealth-creating strategies and fixing those intractable business problems that never ever get fixed. And if you're at a conference when Goldratt was presenting, he'd give examples, and then he would, I always remember, he would say, here's a conventional assumption, and then ask yourself the question, really? And when you ask that question, really, quite often you have a very basic kind of a way of trying to see behind the language and what's at work. Let's talk about some business applications. Kmart versus Walmart. Now, here is a classic case, one firm dissipating wealth, and the other firm, Walmart, creating enormous wealth. Now, if you go back into the early beginnings, the corporate strategy, that Kmart looked at the world in the following way. We need a profitable business, therefore we have to cover the high fixed cost of our stores, and therefore we're going to have big stores in large towns. It all made logical sense to them. Sam Walton said he recognized that customers in small towns were not getting high value, so he said we need big stores in small towns which will provide high value to the customer. Now, what's the hidden assumption? Here's the assumption. Kmart said a store is a store. A store is a standalone entity. Now, Sam Walton just intuitively understood all this stuff. Walton said that a store is merely a node in a network. Radically different way of thinking about what that word store meant. So when Walton decided how to place stores in small towns, they're merely part of a network. So the key thing is, where do you place the warehouses? And then when you're really smart doing that, your trucks can run full both ways, and all sorts of interesting systems applications from that. Okay, let's talk about stock prices. In basic corporate finance, the value of the firm is the present value of a net cash receipt stream. So whether we're talking about brick and mortar firms or Dropbox or Facebook, at the end of the day, there's one constant. It's a net cash receipt stream. So a convenient way of describing a net cash receipt stream is the firm's life cycle. We have economic returns and reinvestment rates, and that if a firm is providing uniquely high value, it can earn above the cost of capital. So if you think of Amazon today, it's on the far left-hand side. High economic returns, high reinvestment rates. Now, all firms eventually face competition. So the economic returns are driven towards the cost of capital, the reinvestment rate slows down, and then you get into mature firms, and eventually firms get below average. Either they have to radically restructure, slim down, or they go bankrupt the way Kmart did. Now, Eastman Kodak is an interesting company because you have a 50-year life cycle for Eastman Kodak. You see that back in the 60s, it was a preeminent firm getting returns twice the corporate average, the cost of capital. And then for 40 years, the return just trended down. And Eastman Kodak, they would hire CEOs that sort of would get it. The CEO from Motorola, a very bright guy, came in, and what he tried to do was to change the culture of the firm. That the firm had a culture which said that Kodak is a film company, and that digital photography is coming on the scene, and you would think with all of the technical skills of Eastman Kodak that they would have changed what they're doing. The culture was so strong, these CEOs couldn't do it, and that's at the heart of why Eastman Kodak today is essentially almost bankrupt. Whereas if you look at Amazon, here again we get back into some key assumptions. What are some of the two critical assumptions that the CEO of Amazon made? Well, we'll start with book distribution. It used to be, I consume an awful lot of books. Amazon even sends me letters congratulating me. I don't read them all, I don't have time, I skim. Okay, what do I want? I want fast, cheap books. And I prefer used books because I get so many of them. So in the old days, I have to go down to the bookstore, and then I'd go through books in print Saturday morning, and then I'd cross my fingers that 3.5 weeks later, I might get these books. So book distribution, we all know the story on how Amazon reconfigured the assumption behind that one. And then he also came back with what really is a book, and now we have the Kindle. So Amazon is doing everything right, really is. Now, when you talk about security analysts and money management, how often do we hear the words undervalued and overvalued? I don't think they're very useful. And when you look at a company and analyze a company, the idea is, especially if you use this CFROI life cycle framework, at a point in time, first of all, analyze where the company has been, the skills involved, and competition and what have you, but then say, what does the market expect? At today's price, let's decode market expectations and then express them in terms of economic returns and reinvestment rates. And when you do that, what becomes incredibly important is the fade rate. How long will these economic returns last? How long can they keep up a specified reinvestment rate? So you'll hear professional money management shops talk about beat the fade. In other words, that you look at a company and you'll analyze it, and first you'll understand why the market is making those expectations. And then if you can make the case that you believe the firm will deliver over the next 2, 3, 4 years, financial performance which will either exceed or be below the market's expectations, then you can get a hold of a company which will generate excess return, whether positive or negative. So it's a much, I think, richer, deeper way of talking it instead of saying undervalued and overvalued. Let's take a look at a life cycle. Whoops. Here's Kmart. One advantage of the CFROI is it wrings out accounting biases, and it's inflation adjusted. So if you're going to display long-term track records, it has to be real numbers, inflation adjusted numbers, where you can't make any sense out of the data. So if we look at Kmart, starting in 1960 on the left-hand side through to the bankruptcy, we see in the beginning, we have the CFROI here in the upper panel. The dark 6% line is in real terms is a cost of capital. In the middle panel, you have the reinvestment rate, and then in the bottom panel, you have the wealth index. How did the stock do relative to the S&P? If the wealth index is flat, it's been doing what the S&P has been doing. I've got another pointer here. Okay, so if you look up here, Kmart was well below average in the 1960s. They invented the discount store concept. So, and the market was expecting dismal returns. Over the next 10 to 12 years, their CFROIs got above the cost of capital. If you look down here, Kmart outperformed the stock market 36-fold in a dozen years. They started with dismal expectations, and they generated performance well in excess of what any investor expected them to do. They then got to the business as usual period, and finally Kmart ate their lunch. Now, during the last 10 years of Kmart, if you read their annual reports, they had a revolving door of CEOs. And the CEOs would all come in with the same story. They'd come in and say, we're going to restructure the firm and we are going to reduce costs and improve profitability. And in a period of, I think, 6 years, 4 of them, revolving door, came in promising the same thing. Now, here again, let's stop for a moment. And I've just tossed out a word, cost. We've all been using that term, accounting cost. What are the assumptions behind the word cost? Okay, now, accounting cost is wrapped up with local efficiency in a system. That's what it's all about. And that when you measure cost of a machine or some part of a system, it's local efficiency. So there's an assumption that all of the components of a system are independent. And if that's true, then if you improve the efficiency of each individual component by reducing the cost, therefore you'll improve the overall efficiency of the system. That's the assumption, and it's totally wrong. Absolutely false. I'll give you an example. You have a system. Here's machine A, here's machine B. Machine B is a constraint in the system. That's the bottleneck. That's where all the work in process inventory builds up. Now someone says, we're in our part of the system is machine A. We're going to improve our efficiency and get a lower accounting cost. We'll buy the super efficient machine A, okay? Local efficiency improves, the bottleneck gets even worse, right? So the overall system degrades. Now that's a really important thought to ponder whenever you see the word accounting cost. Now in all my work on the stuff we're talking about here, it all gets back into thinking about a system, what's the goal of the system, okay? And then, per the goal-wrapped theory of constraints that I subscribe to, you want to elevate the key constraint in the system. Now, if you have a worldview that's focused on accounting cost, what happens? Everything deserves focus, because everywhere you look, you can reduce cost if you really work at it. Whereas if you think with a system perspective, you'll always look for the constraint and elevate the constraint, and after you do that, find out where the constraint has moved. It's a totally different perspective, and a lot of business people who don't get it have a worldview which is about accounting cost. And it's really that simple. Okay, let's look at Walmart. Remember I said that money managers, the name of the game is to beat the fade. Or to find a company, invest in a company, and you can beat the fade. So Walmart is a firm, that I missed with all my wisdom about stock prices and what have you. I analyzed Walmart, for years. Here's the deal. You look at Walmart. And this is a classic of all classics for a larger company. Back here in 1970, it begins economic returns, CFROIs, twice the cost of capital. Look at the reinvestment rate. My goodness, 30–40% real. Okay, this is the best of both worlds. If you want to create, present value, wealth, you want to get high returns, but you want to reinvest at those really high returns. And the ideal world is where you don't fade much in your economic returns and you keep this high reinvestment rate. That's extraordinarily hard to do. Why is it? Empirically, when you look at the data, is that high returns and high reinvestment rates, what does that do? It attracts enormous competition. And so you have all this competition coming in, duplicating what you're doing, earning those high returns, so you fade down at a fast rate. What did Kmart do? It kept this enormous high reinvestment rate going, and it kept its economic returns, and it consistently blew through investor expectations. And year by year, I'm calculating this thing, and I know what the odds are, how hard this is to do. So I never invested in Walmart. What was my failure? My failure was to think clearly about what it means when you have a systems perspective and a radically improving efficiency, and your competitors have an obsolete worldview, how much you can take away from your competitors. I'll give you an example. When barcodes got invented, Kmart installed barcodes, and they said that it'll reduce our accounting costs. It did. The local efficiency of the checkout people increased when Kmart put in barcode scanners. What Walmart did, they did the same thing, but with a systems perspective, a different worldview. All that information got fed into their system. It made their supply chains much, much more efficient. And here again, it left Kmart in the dust. Okay, I got 4 points to cover. Here's the third point. I've been harping on language. Language in one's worldview. Sidney Dekker may be the world's leading expert on airplane crashes and disasters in general. And here's a quote from Dekker. Any language in the worldview it mediates imposes limitations on our understanding of failure. Language, if used unreflectively, easily becomes imprisoning. Language expresses but also determines what we can see and how we see it. If our metaphors encourage us to model accident chains, then we will start our investigation by looking for events that fit in that chain. In one of Dekker's books, he talks about in the year 2000, Alaska Airlines Flight 261 crashed into the ocean. Okay, now, typically what happens, people will say, was it mechanical failure or was it pilot error? Have you all heard those terms, those words? We all know there are assumptions behind those words now, right? Okay, Dekker would say that's not the way to approach the problem. And one of his examples was Alaska Airlines Flight 261. By the way, language really promotes linear cause and effect. And it's, we live our lives in language. It's like fish, swimming in the water. It's transparent. We don't even think about it. And so language, Charlie puts hand on hot stove, Charlie's hand hurts. What is that? It's a noun, verb, noun, and it's linear cause and effect. So when we use language, it tends to promote this simplified cause and effect, just like mechanical failure or pilot error. Now, when Dekker gets into Flight 261 over 20 years, analyzing year by year what happens is you want to understand how the world occurs to people at that point in time. And what took place with what turned out to be the jack screw unit in that plane failed. And then you go back and Dekker points out that the maintenance people and the regulators who oversaw the maintenance work and the airline, everyone did something that they thought was improving their job. That is the root cause of failure of Alaska Flight 261. They would incrementally make adjustments to things, and they didn't feel that they were cutting corners or anything like that. And so that's the root cause of that particular accident. Our perceptions of reality, our use of language, and knowledge building are intertwined. That's important. Let me talk about this whole knowledge building process a bit, because whether you're starting a business, an entrepreneur, or managing a larger organization, this whole thing is how we build up our knowledge base. I can't overstate its importance. I'm going to talk a bit about Edward Jenner. By the way, Edward Jenner developed or invented vaccination for smallpox. In the 1700s, smallpox was the scourge of the earth, okay? And vaccination is an interesting term. Does anyone know where the word vaccination came from? It came from a Latin word, vacca. Vacca means cow. Now that's an interesting story. It comes from a word that means cow. No, by the way, by 1977, the last person on the planet had caught smallpox. Now talk about doing something with your life. I mean, curing one of the world's worst diseases, not treating it, but eliminating it from the planet. Let's take a look at how he did what he did. This knowledge building loop, the idea is there's a loop. You start with a knowledge base, you have a purpose, you have a worldview, you perceive the world, and then you deal with actions and consequences, you generate concrete feedback, and there's a loop involved. Now, in the 1700s, let's start with Jenner. The medical establishment, they were interested in treating smallpox. Jenner was interested in curing smallpox. His mentor was John Hunter, a noted scientist. And Hunter taught Edward Jenner that knowledge is about observation and experimentation. That became Jenner's worldview. Now, in the late 1700s, that was a radical worldview. Other people in the medical establishment, they did not sign on to that scientific worldview. Now, what would happen when smallpox would arrive in towns is that cows would get something called cowpox, and that milkmaids who would work on the cows oftentimes had scratches in their hands, and they'd be exposed to the cowpox, and then some milkmaids would not get smallpox. So Jenner was fascinated by this, and then his peers pointed out that not all milkmaids avoid smallpox, number one, and number two, it is simply insane to think that a virus in a cow could help, deal with a human disease. It was just not part of their worldview. So here again, we encounter a word, cowpox. Now, what Jenner did is he discovered that there are many different versions of what's been labeled cowpox, and that there was one version that had high potential to him. Now, I'm talking about something that took him 20 years of work. Now, the other thing he found out when we talk about, his perception was much different about cowpox. Then he dealt with actions and consequences. He experimented with taking the pus from these blisters that's on the hands of the milkmaids, and then through an enormously clever, intensive period, he discovered that after you deal with the milkmaids that are exposed to the right cowpox, and if you would deal with blisters that were very, very big and blue about 2 weeks after they were exposed, that's what you vaccinate people with. That works. Okay, so it gets back into my point about design firms and prototyping and cycling through all of this. So now, language is totally wrapped around this knowledge building process. So let's talk about a firm that developed a obsolete worldview. Here's IBM in the early 1990s. This may be the most impressive corporate turnaround of all time. Lou Gerstner took over IBM, and this is a quote from his book about his days at IBM. When there's little competitive threat, when high profit margins and a commanding market position are assumed, then the economic and market forces that other companies have to live or die by simply don't apply. In that environment, what would you expect to happen? The company and its people lose touch with external realities because what's happening in the marketplace is essentially irrelevant to the success of the company. This hermetically sealed quality and an institutional viewpoint that anything important started inside the company was, I believe, the root cause of many of our problems. A bureaucratic infrastructure that defended turf instead of promoting collaboration, and a management class that presided rather than acted. IBM even had a language all its own. I think the punchline here is that the worldview of IBM managers was that anything important started inside the company. And Gerstner, he uprooted that obsolete worldview and replaced it with one that was customer-centric. If you look at the life cycle chart for IBM, you see where they got in the trouble. By the way, when you have this enormous success, you dominate the computer industry, you know, high CFROIs, high reinvestment rates, and then you get the notion of business as usual or a past-derived future. So when IBM really got into trouble, it was on the verge of bankruptcy here when Gerstner took over. And prior to that, I read a paper by one of the key IBM managers assigned to developing the PC. And at that point in time, IBM had, evidently, they were best in class in microprocessors and best in class in operating systems. So you would think if they're going to develop a PC that they would do it internally. Well, as it turns out, that the fiefdoms in IBM were so separated and insulated, they just said, we're best in class, we don't have to collaborate, we just do what we do. So IBM gifted the operating system to Microsoft, and they gifted the microprocessor to Intel. It's a mind-boggling mistake. Now, let me get to my fourth point. The fourth point that relates to all of this material is the success of management's change initiatives depends upon their analysis of how the world occurs for employees. That phrase, how the world occurs for employees, is rather important. And it comes from the work of Werner Erhard and Mike Jensen and their colleagues in the Barbados group. I think the work the Barbados group is doing may be the most important work currently being done in terms of improving the performance of individuals, groups, and organizations. I can't overstate this. I encourage you to Google SSRN Barbados Group and just take a look at their work. It has a lot to do with what Mark has talked earlier about integrity. It has a lot to do with improving leadership. It basically is dealing with insights into human behavior applied to increasing the performance of organizations. Now, I really can't, time-wise, get into the Erhard-Jensen stuff in much detail, but let me give you one example, and this notion of how the world occurs to people. I was reading a report by a consultant who, she had an assignment with a company. It's a large, complicated factory. There are 4 machines in the factory that are critical to the operation of the factory. If one of those machines goes down, big problems. So the maintenance people have a bonus system, and the bonus system is tied to machine goes down, how long does it take you to get the machine back up and running? Okay? Now, what the consultant came up with was the following. Why don't we change the bonus system to be based on the length of time in between machine breakdowns? Okay? Simple idea. What's it doing? It changes how the world occurs to maintenance people. Then they start, machine is broken down. They want to figure out what's the root cause of the machine being, breaking, so we can fix it in more of a sustainable way that it'll improve the length of time between machine breakdowns. Okay, let me wrap this up. A summary here. Here I want to just contrast the status quo versus some of the ideas we've been talking about. The first is this idea of an independent reality. In contrast, the role of assumptions in creating this reality. And if you look at the Toyota production system, for example, if in a Toyota factory a pump breaks down. Now, what Toyota does, you probably have heard of this, that there are 5 whys. Why did the pump break down? Well, it broke down because the bearing wore out. Why did the bearing wore out? And you drill back down into root causes. You just don't accept this surface reality that exists. So the other point is this notion of facts, and we know something for certain, versus having a worldview and a knowledge process that keys in on feedback. And I've mentioned prototyping and design firms. The world's preeminent design firm is IDEO. And the CEO has written a couple books, and I remember this one line in one of his books. He says, "We build to think." He's talking about prototyping. We build to think. And what that to me means is that IDEO is all about fast cycles in that knowledge building loop that we've talked about with Edward Jenner and what have you. And the final status quo issue is this excessive reliance on linear cause and effect. Let me back up. The point I wanted to mention on that third point on language. I've said that, we live our lives in language. And most of the time we think about language as a means of communicating. That's kind of like the dictionary definition. And the other day I was reading a book on language, and there was an example that I like a lot. It's about baseball umpires. And it was what do baseball umpires do, the umpire behind home plate. Well, when they talk to an old seasoned baseball umpire, he says the following things. They ain't nothing till we call them. They ain't nothing till we call them. I think that's a good illustration of the power and the role of language in creating these realities. And if you think when the umpire, calls a ball or a strike, think about what it means, not for communication exactly, but what it means for coordination of action. The very next pitch, it has an impact on what the pitcher is going to throw, on what the hitter is going to do. There's an impact on the outfielders and the infielders. So this subtle but important use of language is really, really important. Final point is I've stressed this excessive use of linear cause and effect, and then the Earhart-Jensen Barbados notion of emphasizing how actions correlate with how the world occurs. I'll give you one final example about this. A few weeks ago, I was reading about Edwards Life Sciences in the Wall Street Journal. Now, if you need a heart valve, the existing paradigm is a surgeon takes a saw and opens your chest and goes in there and puts in a heart valve. Edwards Life Sciences has a paradigm-changing invention where a heart valve will be installed not by opening up your chest, but with a catheter, okay? Now, management is doing something very, very insightful, in my opinion. So now we all know that if you're a business, you want to make it easier for your customers to buy your products. And we all know if you have a sales force that you want to motivate your sales force with bonuses tied to sales. Anyone disagree with that? Really? Okay. What Edwards Life Sciences has done is it's paying attention about how the world occurs to people, how it occurs to their customers, the hospital administrators, the surgeons. The first thing that they do is they make it hard for the customer to buy their product. What they do is they require enormous investments in equipment and technology and in training, and their purpose is, their goal is successful operations with the new product. And if you think about it, that's a win-win for everyone. Now, what do they do with their account executives? Do they pay them a bonus based on sales? No. They pay them a bonus based on the number of successful operations that are done at that hospital. Okay? Now, if you think about the simple point about how the world occurs to people, just like the maintenance men when the machines broke down and they changed how the bonus was for the maintenance men, same thing. Now this is really powerful stuff, and it changes, I believe, how you think about all sorts of things to do with wealth creation.